Okay, see a couple people here. Just gonna get my supplies ready. I've got my cookies, got my paint palette. Just gonna add my food coloring, a little bit of charcoal powder. I'll grab a little bit of flesh tone, or you can use brown. We'll go over this if people miss the start. I'll grab a little bit of brown as well. A little bit of blue. Oh, that's peach, not orange. Add a little orange. And sorry if I mispronounced your name. Sarubin, is that right? Sarubin says hi. Yes, I'm right, Sarubin. Okay. We'll just give it a few more minutes for people to log on. This is a smaller class. There's like 30 people who signed up. It was a little last minute. So we'll see how many people join us for the live. And I'm just getting my paint palette ready. I'm also adding, a little bit of white to it. And I, just for when I, like in between cleaning my brushes and everything, I've got a glass of water to rinse my brushes off. And I also like to keep a little bowl just of my vodka, just so that I can sort of dip colors as needed. And I also like to keep a tea towel on my lap, so that sort of in between rinsing of the brush, I can just give my paintbrush a little pat dry in case I need it. It's not great to have a sopping wet brush. Okay, so it's 10 after 4. I started a few minutes late, so we'll just give it a few more minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to turn on my projector and just get my projections all lined up. I think I need to flip my projector around. And of course, my phone is in the way of the projection. Okay, I think that will do. So we'll start with Pennywise, because I think he's maybe a little bit easier than Chucky. A little bit. Sort of less details on his face. So I've just got my plain cookie. It's all dry. And I'm going to start with it's actually the image labeled number 3. And can I get it to move over? No, I can't. Oh my goodness. What is going on? There we go. Okay, finally, he's fitting on the screen. Okay, so he needs to shrink down a little bit. So I'm basically just making sure that these lines of the icing and especially the mouth are lining up with what I see on the projector here. It's a little big. And it's okay if like your chin line, the hairline doesn't totally match up. What's most important is that sort of the shape of the head is, kind of fits and that the smile fits. Because we want the face to be like proportionate. So that looks pretty good. My projector's out of focus, so I'm just gonna focus it. Now we can see things. Probably a good idea to position your cookie while your projector is focused. But it's all still pretty lined up. You guys can see here that the graphic, although the chin lines up, the mouth lines up, the graphic here is a little bit bigger. So don't worry about that. This forehead is a little bit higher here than on the cookie. Just make sure the chin and the mouth are the right sizes so that the rest of the face is all the right size. And we can get started. And basically, this point is just kind of like tracing. So I'm going to start with, actually going to start with a little bit of yellow paint. So I've just got a little drop of alcohol on my brush and I'm just diluting it in some yellow. There's the yellow here. And the very first thing is I'm just going to paint sort of the iris of his eyes. So there's just the one, I guess two eyes. In each eye, the one little swipe of yellow, it's just a little half circle. So you can start by tracing that. So it's just gonna look like 2 little yellow funny marks. Give that a little moment to just absorb into the icing and dry. While that's drying, I'm gonna grab, which one is my red here? Here's my red. I'm gonna grab my red, mix it with a little bit of vodka, and also what I really like to do with red food paint, because it's dark, you don't want it to go on looking, like you can see brush strokes. What I'd like to do is add just a tiny dot, like this much, tiny dot of white into the red, just enough so that it gives it sort of an acrylic opaque effect as opposed to like a watercolor red. So now it will be nice and opaque. Not enough to turn it pink, just enough to make the red opaque. And just trace and fill in his clown nose. All right, well on our way. Now that the yellow has had a few minutes to dry, I'm gonna grab some black. Again, go for the finest tipped brush you can find. These brushes are excellent. They're super, super, super skinny, like super fine tipped. This is also like a really skinny brush, but you guys can see the difference here. This one is so fine. These ones are from my online shop. You can get the same brushes. They've got a mermaid tail though from Inspired to Taste. Yeah. If you're just looking on Amazon or something, you can search for something like nail brushes. Like for nail art, those brushes will have very, very tiny bristles, and the tiny bristles make painting so much easier. Even if you're not like an expert painter, you can achieve much more fine detail just with a super tiny brush. Okay, so I want it to be nice and thick black. I don't want a lot of sopping wet on there. So I'm going to just trace the whole shape of the eye, including like the upper part right here. Oops. And at this point, you can fill in his pupil. It's just a little tiny black half circle. And I'm just going over these lines one more time so that they're really sort of rich, dark, inky black. Okay, so there we go. Sort of the basis of his face. And if you want to take his face, like, or I guess his eyes, maybe just like a step further, I'm just going to mix a little bit of red off to the side here. You guys can see just a little bit of red off to the side and just a tiniest little black, mix it into the red to just sort of darken that red. Make it really, really teeny tiny, maybe a little bit more black. And you can outline the outer ring of his yellow pupil in just a super fine line. It's just going to make the yellow sort of pop. There we go. Sharon says, yo. Welcome, Sharon. Okay, so that's it's step 3, because the first 2 steps were piping and flooding, but that step is done. Okay, step 4, a little bit more intimidating. We've got a bunch of shadows to add onto his face. So we can see here where they are. There's some on his jawline. We're just gonna sort of break them down and do one little shadow at a time. For the shadows, I guess maybe for parts of the shadows, you can use a slightly thicker paintbrush. And I'm just gonna very heavily dilute some black food paint. I mean, I want it really diluted. So I've got it right here. It's just kind of like a gray, you guys can see when I sort of put it on the side here, it's just a very faint gray water. Super important to keep in mind that you can always darken your colors, but if you start painting on your cookie and you start out too dark, it's really hard to lighten it. So always start out on the lighter side because you can always make the color more saturated. So I just created a separate little palette for my super light diluted black. Okay, so I'm just gonna sort of pat that brush dry, get rid of the excess. And I'm just kind of outlining this large shadow on his head here, and then fill it in. Rinse my brush off. And then I'm just covering the projector. What I like to do is with my brush, I've just washed it off and then blotted it dry on my tea towel as I take this now sort of dry damp brush and just sort of rub it along the edge of that shadow. So it kind of gives it like, you know, like an ombre gradient effect. A little bit softer on the edges. So there we go. And also thinking, I'm just grabbing a fresh brush. So this brush is totally fresh, totally dry. You can grab a little bit more, just dip a little bit into some gray, I guess diluted gray water here. And I'm just going to stipple it on sort of the top of his head. So it gets sort of like a little, you know, there's a little bit of texture to it from the bristles being stippled on there. So we've got a little bit of like a textured shadow. Okay, let's realign. And we'll do the same thing with the shadow over here. So I'm just painting it on with this very diluted sort of gray water and just kind of giving it a little blend and a little blot with this dry brush. If you look at some pictures of Pennywise, his head is kind of like, I don't know, really gross and got a crackle effect on it, so this is gonna kind of imitate that effect. So you can see with all the little brush blots that are happening. He's got a textured looking, I guess, scalp forehead. Also just gonna grab, now that we're sort of getting into the detailed shadows around his eyes, I also just like to have a printout on hand so that I can refer to it and see exactly what I'm doing, just to compare the two side by side. So I've just got that beside my cookie as well. Let's see, grab a little bit of this sort of gray water, paint in this shadow sort of above his cheekbone next to his eye. Let's do this one above his brow bone. And again, just start with very light colors because we can always darken it. And having the projector sort of shine down on our cookie does impair our vision a little bit. We can't really see how much color we're depositing, if it's dark enough, if it's not dark enough. So what I like to do is I just lightly sort of paint in these areas first, and then I can move the projector and go back over them and darken them in accordance with the reference graphic. I've got this one, it's just sort of like a straight line down to his chin, and the other side is more or less sort of filled in down to his jawline. Let's move that out of the way. There we go. So that's how it's looking. The color's all very light. We've got some areas here that are supposed to be darker, like right underneath his eye and directly on his right side. So now that I have these areas all sort of started, I can go in and darken them. So I'm just going to sort of touch up his brow and just go back over it. And in between, just sort of while we're here without a projector, step 4 and 5, the different, well, aside from sort of the red, the lips and the, whatever these things are called, the red marks down his face, you can see I've sort of blurred all the shadows. And that's just sort of to demonstrate the step of softening all the edges of these shadows. So just with like kind of a damp, clean brush, you can just sort of rub it along the shadows and just kind of blur it out so it's a little bit softer. Again, same thing with the side of his nose here, and just sort of blurring. I've got my brush, it's clean it off, give it a little dry, and just sort of use the dampness on it to just sort of pull this shadow down, sort of blur it out. It's got a little bit of a sort of a gradient now. All right, we've also got this dark shadow here. The one next to his eye is quite dark, so I'm going to grab a little bit more paint. Still going to have it diluted because, again, I can always darken it. Oh, I did not really dilute that. Let's try that again. Okay. There we go. So I'm just kind of using this brush, sort of wiping it off so it's a little bit clean so that I can blend out those shadows, kind of just sort of dab it around so they soften up. And I can always add more if it's not enough. If you add a little bit too much black, just rinse off your brush, dry it off, and then you can sort of actually manipulate the black that you've already touched down, kind of spread it around. And we got that, we added sort of these darker shadows under his eyes here, and those should be quite a bit darker. So I'm going to go back over those and just extend that dark under eye like all the way over. Try to give my brush a little clean so that I can kind of move this black around. It'll kind of have a little bit of a gradient effect since I'm just sort of moving that color without adding more. Oops, kind of erased a little bit. And now that I'm sort of darkening up all these shadows, I'm gonna darken up sort of these first ones that we put down, the shape of his eye. Just add a little bit more color to it. And by color, I mean black. Just so it's a little bit more intense. And this shadow under his nose has almost completely faded as it's dried. So I'm just gonna add a little bit more color to darken it up. Be careful not to smudge his red nose. And same with his cheeks. Add a little bit more darkness to those. Give my brush a rinse, dry it off. And I can kind of push that color around with the stamp brush. And this is also where it's really beneficial to have let your cookies dry in front of a standing fan. I noted that in the prep video. If you have a lot of humidity in the air, your cookies will dry with like a matte, almost like crystallized finish, as opposed to like a really smooth, shiny royal icing finish. And the smooth, shiny royal icing finish is what lets us sort of move the color around. If it dries with a lot of humidity in the air, the cookie, like the royal icing, as soon as you put that color on your cookie, it's just going to absorb straight into the royal icing. You're not going to be able to manipulate that color and move it around and kind of lift it off of the surface. So that's why I always recommend letting your cookies dry in a dehydrator or a fan, in front of a fan. And I'm going to darken up these chin shadows a little bit. I'm just sort of pushing that color around with a damp brush. Okay, so I think I'm done with step 4. I've got all of my shadows on. There's sort of all the correct darkness. Maybe I want to darken this one up just a touch more. And maybe his brow shadow a little bit more too. It's sort of lightened up. Okay. He's looking good. There's a lot already added. He just needs some teeth and lips. Okay, so let's get everything positioned again. Sort of the wrong size. Let's make sure his chin and nose line up. Oops. There we go. There's his chin. His nose is right there at the top of his nose. And now I can see where the red lips need to be painted. So grabbing my red food coloring. Again, I've mixed it with just a tiny spot of white food coloring to give it an opaque effect. And I'm just going to paint right over top of the edge of the mouth with my thin paintbrush, that sort of red clown lipstick. And the upper lip. It's kind of just like a thin swipe right along the edge of that mouth. Okay, and I know we can't really see it on the projector on the cookie because we sort of painted some details, so some of the projections are obstructed by what we've painted, but you guys can see here that there is a really dark sort of underline right underneath of his nose. So I'm going to add that on, and I'm just going to refer to this printed graphic sort of as I'm painting it because I can't see it very well. You know, on my cookie because the red nose is kind of in the way. But basically it's just a black sort of thick line that follows the underside of his nose. Like so. Now we've got the red, I don't know what you call these things, his red clown makeup. So I'm just going to start with the top one. And I'm just tracing right over those red lines. And just dips down to the corner of his mouth. All right. I mean, his face, I think, is... Oh, it's not quite done, but it's almost there, aside from a few detail lines and the teeth. Sure looks different without the teeth. Okay, so step 6. Again, it's getting harder to see those detail lines, but I can just barely make them out. So again, they're here. So on the step 6, you can see there's his sort of the black little eyebrows. These little sort of black cheek defining lines, and on the bridge of his nose. Oh, and there's actually one extra little sort of swipe up that defines his nose there. So I'm going to start with that one. Just add sort of a little point on his nose, like so. And now I can see the eyebrows, the black sort of, I guess it's actually like the brow bone line. So I'll just do that one. It's just a very thin, like pencil thin sketch line. There's one. There's the other. We've got little bridge of the nose crease. And his sort of cheek lines that are sort of hidden in the bit of shadow. So if you just sort of follow the shape of the shadow. There we go. It's not quite as menacing without the teeth. Also, I realized I need to re-bag my white icing. So I forgot to rebag it. I have my white piping icing right here. The tip of this is a little bit wide. I cut it. I was working on something else. I cut the tip a little bit bigger. But for his teeth, I want to work with a really, really tiny little tip so that I can get it to a really nice point for his sharp teeth. So this is how I really easily transfer bags. I'll just move that projector. So I've got a new bag. Let's just flip it inside out. I've got this old bag. I want to put all the icing in the new bag. I literally just take a pair of scissors, cut straight vertically into the bag. Done. Pop this bag into the new bag. And there we go. They've switched bags. Now I'm ready to cut a fresh new teeny tiny tip, but we're not quite at actually we are at the teeth. That is on the next step. Okay, so I'm gonna cut a very tiny little tip. And this piping icing, it's a little bit runnier than what I usually work with, so I'm gonna cut a really tiny tip because I really wanna limit the amount that comes out. Just do a little practice on the side here. So yeah, that's really nice and thin. Got a little bit of a clog. Might need to cut it just a touch wider. Okay. So for his teeth, I've got white piping icing. I'm going to start with some of the tiny ones that are back there. They're basically just like a little dot that you drag off into a teeny tiny point. And also space them. You don't want to do them all side by side because if they sort of merge together, they'll just turn into one big chunk of white. We want to give them a little bit of space. We can come back and sort of layer the teeth. So just do a few at a time. And I'm just sort of dragging it off into a point. And you kind of want the size of the teeth to be reflective of like the shape of the mouth. So the closer to the middle we get, the longer the tooth is. On the side, they're shorter. And we're just going to add some short ones just at the bottom. So there's the first few. And then once these have sort of crusted over, they're a little bit dry, we'll come and add more and sort of build up the layers, and he'll look like he's got a lot of layers, rows of really sharp, spiky teeth. Okay, so while that's drying, we've got the sort of collar, I guess, shading on his collar. So you can use your projector to line that up. Let's find my next image. Oh, I need to rotate it. And done. You don't need to use your projector for this step, but it might just help, you know, with laying out your cookie. So just try and get the shape of the jaw sort of matched up. And I lost my paintbrush. Here it is. So I'm going to grab a little bit of dark gray. Again, you don't want it to be too dark because we can always darken that color up later on. But if we make it too dark to start with, it's really hard to take that back. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of trace where these lines are. And we also go right around his jawline. Okay, that's good place to start. So now I'm going to start to darken these colors up. And the one around his jawline, that I basically want to be black, because that is where the most shadow would be cast. We want to make it look like his head is coming forward. So then that's going to give us the most sort of depth. Okay, so once you've got that black line, I can kind of blend it out a little bit. So I just got like a little bit of a damp brush, and I'm just running that damp brush right along that black line and just sort of pulling that color out a little bit. You can also sort of drag it out this way once you sort of got a little bit of a gradient going. just drying my brush off real quick, and then again, I'm just gonna go right over that and just sort of blur it out. So you've got a little bit more of a gradient. We're gonna do some white piping over this area, so it doesn't need to be really neatly done. But this will just help add dimension to sort of the layers of ruffles of his collar. And I'm just gonna sort of do one thicker black line around his jawline. I kind of got a little bit on his, it's just a little bit messy, so I'm just gonna go with this fine line and just do a nice sort of thick black line right up against his jaw so that it really stands out and it's nice and crisp. And I'm gonna do sort of the same thing with this outer ring on his collar. I'm just gonna not make it quite as dark. I'll leave it sort of this medium gray shadow. But definitely sort of blending it a little bit more. There we go. All right, and I think the teeth have had a few minutes to dry, so I'm gonna go in and add a few more, sort of closer. Okay, so next up, we're gonna get started on his hair. So I got my projector and gonna line it up with number 8. Oh, I kind of cropped out part of his hair. Just gonna fix that. There we go. So let's get his hair lined, and you guys can see there's sort of areas of darker orange, I guess. Am I sizing right? I could probably go a little smaller. Nope, that was too much. Okay, so there's some darker shadows area, sort of like a darker orange. So I'm gonna mix up a color, and I'm just using the orange that I have here, and I'm gonna mix in a little bit of brown in with my orange. And I'm gonna dilute it. So the orange is, the brown is gonna darken the color of the orange, but you don't wanna use black for that because that would really make it look kind of like dirty with a sort of a gray tone. We don't want that. We just want a darker shade of orange. So mixing a little bit of brown. Let's see if it's too dark. Nope, that looks good. So I'm going to just basically trace and fill in everywhere I see that sort of darker orange. And you should always sort of add the hair details in the direction that like hair flows. So I almost always, you know, unless I'm working from this angle that is against my, you know, my right-handedness. I always try to paint in the direction that the hair goes. So I'm starting at the scalp and I'm dragging it out so I get sort of those natural looking brush hair strokes. Let's just sort of fill in around his hairline here. I can just kind of whip the brush out. Okay, so there we go. We've got some depth to his hair. I'm going to go over to the next step, step number 9. It is our last step, but there's quite a few things in it. Again, there's more hair details, which are harder to see. We can see a few of them. Okay, so there's some darker areas that we're going to add. You guys can see them, so definitely make sure you've got your printed reference graphic. And we're going to do sort of the same thing that we just did with this sort of orangey hair, but we're going to work closer to the scalp. Let's see if I can get this, I don't know, somewhere in view. There we go. So I'm going to darken up again down here, sort of right in this corner here on his hair. We've got basically black. So at that point, I am going to mix a little bit of black into brown, actually, not orange. I just want the color to be dark but warm, and black on its own tends to be quite blue. So if you add a little bit of brown into your black paint, it's going to warm up the tone of the black. So this here is the mix of brown and black for a warm, dark color. And I'm just tracing over those dark areas. And if you have trouble seeing the dark areas, you can use the projector just as guidelines and just sort of copy where they are on the reference graphic. I've got a few more over here. And down here. Okay, and now there's sort of another next level darkness here. So I'm going to add a little bit of orange right into that sort of black-brown mix. It's just over here. It just sort of starts to look like really muddy orange, but that's all good. It's still all in like the same color family. And I'm going to sort of layer that sort of coming right out from the darker areas of hair that we did. And just sort of like whip it out. So you guys can see there's sort of the different layers of darkness to his hair. And also there's no problem at all if they sort of start to blend together. It looks a little bit more realistic. Obviously hair is really hard to digitally draw very realistic. So this is definitely just a guideline. So there we go. We've got the darkest, sort of nearest his I guess, back of the head, neck, and then it's sort of going out into a slightly lighter shade, but still dark, and gradually just getting lighter as we get to the very ends of the hair. We've got another little patch of, really dark up at the top here. So it's just sort of like a little, I guess, I don't even know what you call that, tuft of hair, sort of coming out of, I guess, his widow's peak. So there we go, but it adds lots of dimension. And I like to just sort of add some longer sort of swipes. So you just use your paintbrush to just sort of gently like flick it up. You get some nice hair strokes. So there we go. He's looking pretty good, but we could use a little bit more detail. I'm just going to move the projector now because I've sort of got everything laid out. I want to just be able to see it properly now, and that light was getting in my way. So I'm going to darken up some of these areas, just right at the base, like right up against his head. Add a little bit more darkness right in there. Same here. And on the other side. Okay, so for some of these areas where paint hasn't touched at all, I'm just going to use orange, and I'm just going to mix in the tiniest bit of white. Again, it's going to make the color a little bit more opaque, kind of like we did with the red. So it's more like an opaque orange paint. And I'm going to add some swipes just sort of in there. That will just help differentiate it from the royal icing, but it'll be sort of the lighter color. And also make sure you sort of follow the shape of the cookie. So right here, this should sort of curve up and around. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side, just add sort of some of this bright orange into areas where the paint didn't touch. And you can even sort of swipe it right over. It'll just help sort of blend things together, sort of smooth them out. Okay, so his hair's got lots of dimension and depth now. He's looking real scary. And the last thing I'm going to do with his hair is I'm just going to use a tiny bit of, it's kind of like how we added the little tiny black details on his face, like his brow bone. I'm going to do just sort of very similar thing to his hair. Grab a little bit of black paint on a paintbrush and just add some individual little hair strokes. Just sort of a few in each section. Just sort of coming out of the roots of his head. Just a few swipes. Sort of the last thing that will sort of make the texture of his hair pop. Okay, there we go. Hair, I think it looks pretty good. And maybe now that that second row of teeth has had some time to dry, I can go back in and layer some like right on top. There we go. So we've got lots of rows of teeth. And I'm just gonna use my scribe to sort of push down, I guess, sort of smooth out some of the little ends of the piped line. Oops. You know what, actually might work better with a paintbrush. Just so you don't see like as noticeable those sort of little round ball end, you know, where our piping bag initially touches. So I'm just sort of running that along that icing, smoothing it out. There we go. Okay, so very last thing is his frilly collar. So we've got sort of the shading on here. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm taking my piping icing and I'm gonna cut a little bit of a thicker tip. And sort of just near, still thicker. Sort of near the edge of the cookie, but not right on the edge. I'm just going to squeeze like a wiggly line all the way along. Okay, and now I've got a paintbrush. It's a little bit damp. You can dampen it, dry it off. It's just was a little bit damp. And then, oh, and it's quite orange. Didn't clean it very well. So rinse that off, give it a dry. And now you're just going to drag it inwards towards his face, all the way around. So there's one row of lace collar, and then I'm gonna do another row just sort of right on the sort of the white area that's showing through where we didn't paint the shadow. There we go. And same thing. So it's just a slightly damp paintbrush, and you're just going to pull it right in towards his face. And a damp paintbrush sort of helps to get it smooth. But always pulling it right towards his face. And that is it for Pennywise. Whoops. Oh, of course, just jam my finger right into his wet collar. Okay. But that's it for Pennywise. So he's got some real nice physical dimension in his collar and his teeth. And then the painted details just are like a 3D effect. Makes it really look like he's coming at you. But he's totally flat. And up next is Chucky. His red-headed counterpart. I don't know. His red-headed nemesis. Another guy's clowns and dolls. Soon Chucky will be just the same, just popping right off the cookie. Okay, I'm just getting my graphics, just pulling them up. So totally not that bad when you do it in steps. That was 1 hour, almost on the dot, that we painted the whole Pennywise face. Okay, so Chucky is next. He's got a little bit, I guess, more details, kind of different level of detail. Let's focus that projector. That looks good. I can sort of see his eyeballs showing up. And I think that size is perfect. You can see here that my graphic isn't lining up with, where I've piped my royal icing. That's totally fine. Doesn't matter. That's going to happen because royal icing, it spreads, it moves as it's drying. So that is totally fine if that happens to you guys. Just make sure that his eyes line up. So you want to see his little blue irises. Somewhere on the white eyeballs, you want the sort of the scratch mark, the gash down his face. You want those to match up. Most importantly, secondary is sort of the hairline. And did I get my blue paint out? I did. Okay, so for his eyeballs, again, blue paint. Since his eyes are quite a light shade of blue, I'm gonna mix a little bit of white, food coloring here, in with a little bit of blue. And that's gonna sort of guarantee we get a really nice opaque blue color. And we can just water it down with a little bit of vodka so that it dries quickly. Okay, so Chucky's eyeballs. You can see his irises, and I'm just going to sort of carefully paint around. And you don't want to paint his pupil. Leave a spot, so I'm just sort of tracing around the pupil there. So leave a spot for his pupil. you know, if we paint it all blue and then add the pupil, the black might bleed into the blue. So that's why I like to sort of keep them separate. Okay, so we've got two little blue irises there. I've left the pupils uncolored. Let's just give that a minute to dry. And we just add a little bit of black circle just right in the middle. And the black ink will be absorbed into the icing that's right below it, as opposed to painting black on top of blue, in which case the black is just floating on the blue and it may sort of disperse into the blue as opposed to, you know, sticking to the icing that's right underneath. So there we go. It's creepy little eyes. Okay, so Chucky has a lot of shadows going on his face, many more than Pennywise, which is what makes him maybe a little bit more, I don't know, detailed, a little bit more scary. But they're really not that bad. So you can see them all really well here. Again, I've got my printed graphic just so that I can always refer to it, since the light shining on my cookie does sort of impair my vision of what's going on. So like Pennywise, I'm going to start. Let's sort of get it as best line up as I can. There we go. So like Pennywise, let's see, I've got flesh tone here and a bit of brown. So I'm going to mix just a dab of, if you guys can see this, a little bit of brown here with a little bit of flesh tone. Brown is fine on its own. I just find that the brown food color, it's very flat brown, whereas it used to be called Chef Master Flesh Tone, but I think they must have had issues because obviously there's more than one flesh tone. They've renamed it Sienna. But for just this, you know, little doll's face, it's perfect color. There's sort of a little bit of pink and yellow undertones in the Sienna, which work really well for white flesh tone. So I'm just mixing a little bit of the Sienna Chef Master color with a bit of the brown, and the brown is going to sort of darken it up. And I'm just going to dilute it quite heavily because, again, I don't want to add too much color. I can always add more later, but I'm going to start by just sort of coloring in. Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty good. It's not too dark. I could even make it more diluted. I'm just sort of tracing over these areas, his neck. And this sort of whole side of his cheek, I'm just gently tracing over it. And as you can see, the color's not very dark. We're definitely going to darken it up with time. But for now, just fill that whole thing in. I'm just going to clean my brush off and just sort of, I'll block that, clean my brush off and just drag my clean sort of damp brush along that edge, and it's sort of going to blur that shadow. Same over here. So it's not quite as like sharp. But we got a few more shadows to go. So we've got this one above his eye. Just paint that in. We've got this one above his other eye. Again, we're going to come back and darken those up because they do need to be quite a bit darker. We've got his horrible little nose, I guess, scrunch, little dimples. So I've just gone over all of those. Last thing to go over is his mouth. I'm going to do his mouth in a slightly different color. I'm going to take a bit of this sienna, like the flesh tone sienna Chef Master color here. I'm going to mix it with a little bit of red, and that's going to give it a little bit more of a pink tone for his lips. And I'm using my super thin brush to paint those on because those we're not going to blur those or anything. We want his lips to be quite crisp. There we go. So I'm going to move my projector out of the way so I can see what's going on. Pennywise can go off to the side. And I'm just going to have these next to each other so I can just compare the darkness of the shadows. Okay, so I'm going to darken this one up quite a bit. Oof, I've just taken a bit more brown. And just sort of paint that right on there. Okay, so this shadow here, it needs to be quite a bit darker, which does mean that we need to bring in a little bit of black, but we're gonna do some of the other ones. Before we do that, I'm gonna let this dry for just a couple minutes. So I'm just taking a bit of black food coloring just over here on my palette, and I'm gonna mix in a bit of brown. Again, this is gonna warm up the color black if there's a bit of brown mixed into it, as opposed to just pure black, which has quite blue undertones, and we don't want blue undertones in the skin. Okay, so we've got the shadow over his eye. So this is my black-brown combo, and I'm just painting that right on. It's quite a bit darker. Just wash my brush off. And just give my brush a little bit of a dab dry so I can just kind of gently move this color around with my damp brush. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other eye. So this is going to be filled in quite a bit darker. And then on the side of his face, So we're getting there. I'm gonna darken and just go right over these little markings. So you guys can see how adding the little bit of black to brown neutralizes the warmth. And I've just cleaned up my brush and just sort of going over it gently with the damp brush to just kind of soften it, sort of blur and soften it. All right, and we've got this last little section, sort of the crinkle in his, I guess his brow. I don't even know what, yeah, it's like his brow hangs really low here. Okay, so now this section I can see it's dry, it's absorbed into the cookie. I'm gonna go back now with this sort of black brown, and I'm not gonna start right on the edge. I don't wanna, it's too risky a game. So we're gonna start at the ear. And just paint that on because we can work the color out this way so that we don't lose sort of this gradient effect. And again, keep close to his hairline here. And we can just add just sort of this little triangular shape of his neck here. That we can darken for sure. And now my brush is clean and sort of damp, and I'm just sort of blurring that really dark shadow, kind of working it into the lighter brown shadow that was already there. Okay, so I think that's looks pretty good. It's quite dark. It's pretty good. Let's grab that projector again because I just want to make sure I can get here his jawline in the correct spot. So let's line it all back up and I can see it. So I'm just gonna grab my tiny little brush, dip it in some black. Just kind of trace it out. So there we go. And again, now I can just sort of add a little bit more to it, sort of fix the shape. Sort of bring it up to meet the bottom of his ear. And I'll just give it a little sort of bit of a blur at the bottom. Just sort of blend it in. Whew, okay. So he's looking really scary because you've got all kinds of shadows and no real details. So let's go to the graphic number 5. There it is. Get them all lined up. And looks like we're going to be painting in some teeth. Okay, so for the teeth, kind of like how we did his eyeballs, we want to paint not in the teeth area for like the black sort of back area of his mouth. The inside of his mouth is what I'm trying to say. So I've got my tiny little black paintbrush, and I'm going to just gently sort of trace around the shape of the teeth on the top and the lower. So there we go. And then the inside can be filled in. Oh, I also included a little bit of a sliver of tongue in the graphic, but you can include it or not. You would never notice it. I think that's why I didn't even notice it just now. We've also got a little teeny tiny gum line. So for his teeny tiny gum line, I'm gonna add a little bit of black, mix a little bit of black and red, just to make a really dark shade of red for his gums, just to differentiate from the lips themselves. And like we just sort of outlined the teeth just there, we're gonna do the same thing with the bottoms of the teeth. So you can just sort of fill in where a little gum line might hit his teeth there. And same thing on the top. Basically just sort of outlining the bottom, like the inside of his lips, and adding a little bit of a point for the gum line. I'll show you up close. So there we go. You guys can see there's little bits of gum lines or the little points. And now all we have to do for his teeth is just paint in the white. And also if there's any areas of sparse black where you can see the cookie background sort of showing through, just do another little layer of black so it's nice and filled in. Okay, so for teeth, I grab a little bit of white on my paintbrush and just fill in that negative space. So there we go. So his teeth are now painted in white. And now that my projector's away, I can see there's just like a little messy area. So I'm just gonna fill that in. There we go. I also think I sort of missed his jaw a little bit. think it needs to sort of come up a little bit, so I'm just going to cut his jaw just a little bit more. And we'll paint his hair, so if you get some food coloring on his hair, no big deal. Okay, next image. So I believe it's number 6. And this is where we add all of his injuries. Okay, sizing's not quite right. There we go. That alignment looks pretty good to me. So you can use just straight black. I just like to mix the black in with a little bit of red so we get sort of a little bit of that really dark blood color. And just on tip of my tiny paintbrush, I'm just going to drag that right along these marks that I see. And if they're a little bit wobbly, that's just fine. You can add a few more sort of little swipes coming up out of the eye sockets, just sort of make it look a little bit more ragged. We've got one right across the nose here. And sort of right around this, I think it's supposed to be his skull that's showing, so I'm just sort of outlining the shape of that. Got one more down the side of his face. Okay, and now there's also, so those are all the injury lines, and we've also got some facial feature lines, like his ears, the little nose details, his smile lines. So I'm gonna do that next. So that's just pure black. We've got a little sort of the outside of his nostrils right here. There's just one. Again, you can refer to your printout if you're sort of struggling to see it. There's the other one, and his other nostril's kind of blocked by this shadow, so I'm just taking a peek at the printed reference graphic just to make sure I sort of can tell where it is. It's right there. We've got his smile lines. Here's one, and the other. And sort of the definition of his jaw here. This is just tracing the outline of his face. And his ear. And the other ear, which is really hard to see, so I can just barely see it. You guys probably can't see it on the screen, but I can see it here. But there's just a couple little lines that make up his ear, so I'm just kind of making this up now because I'm having trouble seeing it. I can just sort of barely make out the outline. There we go. I think I got it, and we'll just sort of fill in that darker inner ear. And also this smile line, I missed it, comes down a little bit. There we go. Now he's alive. Okay, so we've got all those detail lines on. He's got his scars. He's got his facial features. Now we're just adding the stitches. So I'm just referring to the graphic. I don't think I need the projector to lay those out for me. I just need to know sort of which lines they're going on. So we've got one right above here. You could probably also pipe these on in black royal icing if you want even more of like a 3D effect. So I've got one over here. I've got two on his cheek. 1, 2. This whole strip has got stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And down his chin. Same across his nose. And a couple here. And this one, I'm just sort of painting it on either side. This would be a good spot for piping them on, probably. I think those are all of his stitches. I'm gonna darken up this little line just so we can define his ear a little bit more. Great. Okay, so step 8, the only thing here I think is we've added on, you don't have to do this step, but we've added on just a few little orange strokes for eyebrows. You can barely see them, but if you want to do them, I'm just mixing in a little bit of white food color with orange food color so that they, so that it actually does show. Otherwise, the orange would just absorb right in. You wouldn't see it against the brown shading. So I'm just mixing in a little bit of white so it's opaque. And just gonna paint just like some little orange brush strokes right across his brow. You'll barely notice it, but it does sort of change the color. It gives a little bit of an effect. So there you go, barely noticeable, but it does add something. And you'll also notice that his hair is darker between these two, and that's because his hair is actually darker than Pennywise's, but I hate making more icing than is necessary. So this one, we're just going an overall swipe with a slightly darker orange shade. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but That's what I did. And also the collar of his shirt is supposed to be red, but again, didn't want us to have to make too many different colors of icing for these two smallish cookies. So we just paint that. So I'm gonna grab some red food color and just paint that right over his collar. So got nice dark red. And his hair, I'm just gonna give it a very light wash with sort of an orange brown color just to slightly darken the shade. So it's just a little bit darker now. And grab my projector again. And just go to that next image. Okay. So last step, step 9, is where we've got all of his hair details. So there's quite a few. And I want to see them. I'm going to turn off some of my lighting so that I can really see what's going on here. There we go. So I can see way better now. I can see the projection at least way better now. Okay, so let's get this sized up. A little bit less. Oh. Perfect. So for this hair, his face isn't quite lining up, but I mostly just want the hairline and the ears to line up since that's sort of where I'll be working. And I'm going to start with all of the dark areas. So I'm going to grab brown and mix it with a bit of orange. But again, we want to go pretty heavy duty on the brown because these sections are quite dark. And I'm just going to start filling them in. So there's one. Two. So there we go. It's starting to come together. Oops, shifted it a little bit. Okay, so those are sort of my most important, my key areas. Flip lights back on. And I can probably move the projector. Perfect. Okay, so we've got these dark areas. I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna darken them even more. You guys can see here, there's some black in these areas, but this is sort of gonna shape out his really sort of tufty hair. So, oops, wrong brush. Grab our black, and I'm just adding some of this black to the bottom and just sort of swiping it up. Same on this side. This side's almost completely just black. All right, and I'm gonna add sort of do a little bit of a blend outwards, at least sort of up along his ear. There we go. Again, I'm going to add a little bit more black into this sort of swipe over here. Okay. So we've got some lines happening. Or I guess like tufts, sort of define the areas of his tufting hair. And now we can add some other ones that sort of are indicative of these little sort of swipes that I added into the graphic. So I'm just going to go with a slightly darker orange and just sort of add some swipes sort of coming up. I'm actually going to use this tiny little brush. I've just got a little bit of brown on it, and I'm just sort of connecting these sections. So we've got this one coming up from sort of the point of his hairline all the way down. Add sort of some swipes around this sort of little area. Just shows the direction of his hair. Same with this one. And I'm just doing these ones sort of just coming out from like his hairline, just sort of swiping down, following the direction of his hair. I did a little dark there. It's okay. Just sort of blend it in to that little black section. And I want to darken up this side for sure, just because we've got that heavy shadow, so his hair should probably be shadowed to match. I'll grab a little bit of black for that and just do some sort of black swipes, black little hair strokes around that side of his head. Same with around his ear. Again, we're heavily cloaked in shadow over here, so there should be quite a few shadows around his hairline. And I'm also using some black to go over and add sort of hair strokes in these really dark sections that we've done. So again, always follow sort of the direction that we've already laid out. So again, I'll do some sort of darker roots where a shadow would be hitting. And there's another little one, just sort of fill that in with some dark brush strokes. And now back to, actually add a little bit more here. Okay, and add some more to the top of his head. So I'm just going to start with some little sort of swipes just near his hairline and just sort of pull them up and out. And I want to follow sort of this whole little widow's peak. I want to follow this same direction as this sort of shadow here. Where the cookie curve is right there, that's where we can just end that tuft of hair. And then this one will be going this other way. And again, I'm just adding all the brush strokes starting right at the scalp. It's just going to make it really look like it's sort of lifting off of his head. And there we go. I've got a few more details, just like very light, just adding some shading to his overalls. So I just want to sort of make his collar look a little bit more realistic. So what I'm going to do that is just grab some black. I'm just going to sort of, you know, the shape of it's a little messy, so just add like, just sort of fill in the shape of it, just so it's a little bit cleaner. Again, you can paint a little sort of stripe of black right along the top of it. It'll kind of act as like the shadow it would cast on his neck. And maybe just like a little swipe along the bottom. If it's a little harsh, you can just sort of blend it in, blend it into that red. And finally, just sort of the shape of his overalls. So I'm just going to outline them. Let's see. It's just sort of, you can see a little bit of shirt underneath his overalls. It's just kind of like, you just square it off like that. And I'm going to use a little bit of black and mix it with a little bit of blue to just sort of make it a slightly darker color and just paint right in that area. And then I do want to add a little bit of shadowing to his shoulders so that it looks like his hair is casting some shadows on his shoulders. So that is just right at the top of his shoulders. Just blend some black in and just sort of, you want to do that same ombre gradient effect, bring it down, just sort of blend it. There we go. And that's both of them. That's every step. And if you want, you can also add some highlights to the hair. I just take a little bit of, make sure you add a little bit of orange to the white. You could just take a little bit of white, take a little bit of orange, but it should be mostly white, but you know what, or yellow, to just make sure that the white doesn't turn gray when you apply it to the cookie. You just add a little bit of yellow or orange to the white, and we can just swipe on just some sort of highlights onto the hair that just sort of, again, add a little bit more dimension. Oh, that's quite yellow. Don't add as much yellow as I did. It's very, very, very yellow. Let's add a little more orange to that. Okay, that's better. Again, just adding a little bit of sort of highlight. Adds a little bit more dimension. Again, makes it pop. Makes the dark areas really pop. I can do the same for Pennywise, just do some sort of lighter swipes of little brushstroke hairs, just sort of towards the ends. we go. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. That's all there is to it. And that's Chucky and Pennywise. Can't wait to see how your cookies turn out. Definitely post them to the group. Post them on Instagram, tag me. I can't wait to see how they turn out. And definitely if you have questions, feel free to message me directly, post them in the group, in the comments of the video, whatever's easiest. And I'll get back to you guys as fast as I can. But that's it. You guys have any last minute questions? Everyone good? Everyone's good? There's very few of us right now watching live. But okay, for sure, if you're watching the class recording, I know there's like 30 people in the class. Of course, I don't expect everybody to show up for the live. We've all got things going on. But yeah, if you're watching the class recording and you have a question that can't be answered in real time because the live stream is done, it's just a class recording, feel free to message me any way that is most convenient for you. And I can't wait to see how everything turns out. Thanks so much, guys. See you next time. Oh, and Sarubin asks, is there a time limit for the video link you sent? No. So once this live stream is done, I just click finish. I post it to the group. It might take a few minutes to upload to the group just because the video needs to process. But as soon as that's done, it usually doesn't take more than a couple minutes. So within a few minutes from now, the live stream, the whole recorded version will be posted in the group. There's no time limit. It will be here for as long as the group exists, which will be forever. I won't ever delete it. So it will be in the group forever. And then also probably within the next 24 hours, I'll have the cookie prep video and this class recording uploaded to YouTube. And I'll also email everyone in this class the link to the group in case they haven't yet joined the group. A few people haven't. And also will contain the course documents as well as the links to this video and the cookie prep video on YouTube, so that if you don't have a Facebook account, you didn't join the group, and that's why, you can review it on YouTube. Yeah, and just for ease of finding it, you don't have to rifle through a group to find the videos. You can refer to the YouTube links. But yes, videos will be here forever, and I'll also send out links to the class recordings probably by tomorrow. So no time limit. You guys can do it. You guys could do it next year for Halloween. It'll always be here. Yeah, and that's it. We'll see you guys next time.